right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is our initial Tuesday program. We're calling it Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. You guys know us from our Thursday program, which is
Foreign policy.
What's our Thursday program?
Foreign policy review.
Foreign policy review. So today we have a lot to discuss. We had an interesting week since last Thursday. We have our special guest today from Moscow is Ian Kummer, and we're going to get his take on the week's events. Before we get into that, is there anything anybody wants to discuss before we go right to the whole Prigozhin affair?
No.
I want to hear about the Prigozhin affair, this weekend's event.
Yes. Ian, are you ready to tell us your thoughts on the whole ordeal that we've been dealing with? Everybody has a take. So what is your take on what went on this week?
Well, it was. I'm still processing it. I think everybody, both inside Russia and internationally, is still trying to figure out what's happened. It happened very quickly. Mind you, of course, we're 8 hours ahead of you all on the Eastern Seaboard. It kind of hit everybody by surprise. Prigozhin was doing his usual rants, and then there was this story he was claiming that the Russian MOD had done missile strikes on a Wagner position, which turned out to be fake news, but he shared this edited video clip making that claim, and then he started that whole protest march towards Moscow with an uncertain number of people in vehicles. That's still disputed now. And from beginning to end, the whole event was about 36 hours. And as this was developing, nobody had all of the information. No one really knew, even as it was happening, what was going on. But beginning to end, it was about 36 hours. And so, I don't know. What do you want to ask me? So what I think was happening, blow by blow, what I saw, or
the facts. I mean, it's interesting that you're saying the missile strike was a hoax. We heard all kinds of things, and it's hard for us to know what is a fact and what is not. So multiple helicopters being shot down, a plane being shot down, and it's just. I've heard everything's in dispute, and it's like, what is real? So from your vantage point in Moscow, I mean, maybe just go, chronologically from the beginning, and what is a documented fact that viewers can really believe is true.
Well, so that's
definitely
tough.
The missile strike isn't true, right? The missile strike.
Well, I wouldn't state that as a fact because that's the allegation that's being made that it's fake. So that's another allegation. I mean, it could be true. I mean, it's not. I am not a video forensics expert, so I can't sit there and stick my name to it that it's a fake. But that's what a lot of different people are saying. The aircraft being shot down, the types and number are still a little bit up in the air, but it did happen. The Russian MOD official channels and Putin himself have acknowledged the deaths of pilots. So that part of the story is true.
Do we know how many?
Last I heard was 13 or more. I think.
Oh, wow.
I think there is. It was a significant number. It was more than one. It was multiple aircraft downed. Some people were able to eject. Some people weren't. So that part is real. There was actual armed conflict.
Yeah, That's when it got real to me, when Vladimir Putin, during rest today, we were expecting a speech, but it was basically a 5-minute address to the people. He acknowledged those heroic dead in the aircraft, the armed forces, the air forces. That means it's no longer like a maskirovka. It's not a Psy-Op. I was for a very long time convinced it was, but just for context of what to know and what not to, on Saturday, during these events, the West and Telegram channels on the Ukraine side, NATO, they were showing videos, footage, photos from a year ago, from Libya, from everywhere else in the world. So nothing could be trusted. And even this aircraft downing, we haven't seen visual evidence. It has been acknowledged, but we haven't seen anything. And then we get onto the march on Moscow, which is from Rostov. that is the place where Wagner took over. And correct me if I'm wrong, that's a 10-hour drive, something like that. And he sent
something like that. Yes,
4,000 and 8,000 people. That's what I've heard. The two numbers that come up, but unknown. But then 36 hours later, I mean, what about the end?
have been I've always been, so I write at my blog readingjunkie.com where I comment on current events, media, films, books, movies. So I've been so you can even look at my older stories. I've been skeptical about Wagner Group for a long time. I was never a fan of Wagner Group. I mean, Wagner Group is very popular, not just internationally, but within Russia itself. A lot of Russians like Wagner Group. It's a similar story, actually, to like Blackwater and private military groups in the USA during the War on Terror. They got very popular. They're always depicted very heroically in the media. And I think it's this idea that we have that, militaries tend to be this kind of inept bureaucracy. So, you have these lightweight heroes in the private sector who just, cut out all the red tape and get stuff done. So they have this. So mercenaries have always had this kind of larger than life persona. And I've never been a fan of them because nation states should have a monopoly on violence. It's not a good idea to give corporations, private businessmen, the license to have weapons and use force on that scale.
Yeah, there's definitely a downside, as we saw. I mean, there's a downside. Obviously, from the perspective of some people in the government, there's an upside as well. I mean, because they can do things, in a legal way that the Constitution does not allow, like the Russian military to operate, right? So that was part of the reason for the creation of Wagner.
There are several upsides that makes these PMCs very attractive. One, you can distance yourself. So a government that uses PMCs can distance themselves from those operations. So if there's a certain country that they want to have a military presence in, but don't want an official military presence in, they can use a PMC. If they want to distance themselves from casualties, because casualties, despite whatever you've read in the news, it is very hard to cover up casualties, especially fatalities, especially if they happen in large numbers. So when you have your own uniformed soldiers in a country and they suffer casualties, it's very hard to keep that under wraps. But with mercenaries, you can distance yourself. So you can keep those on the down low. It's the same thing in Afghanistan. The official number of American troops killed in Afghanistan was very low. It was about 2,000, if I remember correctly. But then you start looking at it was only 2,000, but you had another several thousand mercenary deaths. You had 80,000 ANA deaths. You had all these addendums to that official number, which is kind of the same thing that you have here in the Russians' special military operation. In their military intervention, just like we did in Afghanistan, you had groups besides the official Russian MOD, and those numbers are easier to keep out of the public. So a long story, but I'm digressing. A long story short, PMCs have benefits because there's a reason that governments are attracted to them and use them. But
go.
Jeremy Scahill in his book on Eric Prince and Blackwater, obviously
I read it.
confirms
Yes.
your notion of glorification of these groups. I just wanted to back up a bit and talk about the initial attack on that Prigozhin was claiming on his troops by Russia was 2,000 dead, as far as I understand, and that seemed to me that seemed to point toward instability in Prigozhin himself, a kind of mental breakdown of some sort. I wonder if do you also think that is part of the problem? I mean, part of the case here.
Well, I think even before all this kicked off, this feud kicked off, I was skeptical about the size of Wagner. I think Prigozhin grossly exaggerates it. Like these numbers that Wagner has 25,000 men, that they have 50,000 men, that they have 100,000 men. It was I wrote an article a few weeks back, right after Prigozhin made his claims about the number of men he lost in Bakhmut and the number of Ukrainians he killed. Neither of those numbers made much sense to me. The big one was that he was claiming that he had 50,000 convict soldiers. Well, Russia does not have a large prison population. They only have about 380,000 prisoners. So when you think about it, out of those, that tiny number of people he was able to recruit them. So I never believed the size of Wagner. I would be very surprised if they had more than 5 or 10,000 people total. When you get numbers larger than that, it's very hard for a private enterprise to have that large battlefield footprint. So I was always skeptical about their size too. I think they were always larger than what they have a great PR campaign. I always think they were larger than life. But as far as this incident goes, yes, the missile strike, especially since we have to question how long ago did Prigozhin start planning this move on his part. So whatever that triggering event was, that Gulf of Tonkin moment he was going to use to justify it, kind of negates even the accusation, because if we know he was planning this days or weeks ago, then the missile strike he used to justify it, we know is nonsense, because he was planning it before that even allegedly happens.
Or since January, as Larry Johnson, ex-CIA, recently noted. I don't know what the case is, but before we move on to the state of mind and the goals of Prigozhin, which should be next, I just wanted to stop on this PR machine about, glorious PMCs. 1 year ago, the SMO just started. I had one friend who was in former military, and he said, there's these guys called Wagner. They're like spooks. They come in with the hammers. They go out, no cameras. You haven't heard of them. And I haven't. I tried to Google them. They were ghosts. They were not everywhere. I mean, I guess they're really well known now since the battle for Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, and Prigozhin has become this television star, the face of the thing. But they were ghosts 1 year ago. And now that he became the face, he's public. Everybody else is masked. You're not supposed to show your identity. But Prigozhin, the bold man, the chef, exquisite, he was the television face of a huge battle. 75,000 people, I think, on the Ukrainian side died, at a 3-1 advantage, according to Scott Ritter. So, yeah, their numbers were small, but they won. And I'm just wondering, Africa, a lot of people celebrated when those flags went up over the remainder of Artyomovsk. So they do have, hero status, not just in Russia, but internationally. So that sort of happened with the PMC, even though I agree with your point that it should belong to the state. It should be under the umbrella of the Ministry of Defense, which is partly what this was all about. And then, Prigozhin, there's a couple of claims that came out. Kadyrov said that he broke because his daughter didn't get a parcel of land in St. Petersburg. That was one part. Lukashenko, in his recent revelations in Belta, a Belarusian paper, said there was a lot of frontline commanders who saw thousands of people dead, and they had PTSD, and he was under their influence to do this ridiculous move, the March on Moscow, the March for Honor, or something like that. What do you think? What role did Prigozhin's state of mind play in this whole thing?
Well, I heard both of those statements by Lukashenko and Kadyrov, and they might both play an element in this, because the guy is always, because he was an oligarch who sprang up. He is a self-made man. He used his personal charisma and connections to make his business empire. And, he was, as a young man, he did go to prison. He did serve hard time in a penal colony, and those all shaped his mindset. So, and he was always eccentric, and up until this point, I always had to wonder, when we say these fairly outlandish statements, especially his personal feud with Shoigu. He was always tearing down the Russian MOD, saying the military is incompetent, Shoigu's incompetent, saying these things that really are not inappropriate to say about your own team.
And during wartime too.
Right. And so we're like, is he just saying these things, or is this some sort of disinformation campaign? Is he getting permission to say these things? We had to wonder these things, but now it seems like it wasn't, a planned it was just him going off the rails. So to answer your question, there's no way to tell, but I will say that, especially him, someone who's not made a career in the military, like those commanders who just comes and combat and a high tempo operation like this, if he's just getting personally involved for months, that can take a psychological toll. It's not, I don't mean it just in a Hollywood sense. There's this Hollywood, oh gosh, what's it? Tom Hanks and Saving Private Ryan, the slow motion.
Yeah.
It's kind of a silly, it's a Hollywoodism, but in real life, yes, just this nonstop tempo, it can make can take your mind to weird places and make someone crack. It can. And then there's also what Kadyrov made the allegation that you have this guy who is used to using his connections to get whatever he wants, to make connections for his family members, for his daughter, and when that doesn't work out for him, especially with the way Russia's changing now, it's becoming more of a polite society. Those things people used to be able to get away with in the 90s and early 2000s doesn't work anymore. Those things just are not appropriate anymore.
That's what
he's getting left behind. He's getting left behind by the new system. It's more of a polite society. That whole prison yard mentality that worked for him 10, 15 years ago doesn't work anymore. And that's the way he was handling it too. He thought he could, it's like getting into a beef with another inmate at the prison. I'm going to go out and I'm going to beat the crap out of this guy, make a point. He's kind of using that same mindset here, which did not work for him. And I do think he also he drank a lot of his own Kool-Aids too, because he is very popular. Even now, he's still very popular. He probably thought a lot of military people, a lot of police, a lot of the public would take his sides, but in reality, nobody took his side. Everybody rallied around the actual government. Everybody did. So when Lukashenko, who's the kind of that third party, called him, by that point, Prigozhin had to have realized that this was not going to work. He was just going to be stopped. Had no chance at all of working. Regardless whether it was 500 or 5,000 people, there was no chance of this working. But it was going to be a bloodbath, because when you have that big of a confrontation with people who have tanks and vehicles and guns, it's going to cause a lot of human losses on both sides. So everybody was interested to avoid that. Because the pilots dying was a tragedy, but if there had been an actual armed conflict between two large bodies of people on the ground, it would have been a bloodbath. So that's why they were basically playing those delaying tactics. And I'll say that even in Moscow, I wasn't there. I didn't see the convoy. Besides on video, I didn't see more than what anyone else did. But it's true, we did have the anti-terror regime. They were barricading and tearing up the freeway. They were doing those delaying tactics, which in hindsight makes sense, because at the time we're just like, what is going on? Why aren't they stopping them? What are they doing? But as it turned out, that conversation between Lukashenko and Prigozhin had already started. And so at that point, everybody else was just delaying the confrontation until Prigozhin himself called everybody home. So.
Yeah, thank God. You brought in, Billy Bob, you're next. Sorry, I saw that you want to say something. You brought in, just to rehash, two important aspects. One is what used to be called shell shock in the Tom Hanks movie, which is now called PTSD, which has a real effect on the psyche. And basically in the 1990s, the chaos after the Soviet Union, businessmen fell like flies. They killed each other on the streets. It was a brutal reality back then when he made his fortune as a restaurateur, when he came out on top and went to prison. So to me, that was two important little contextual notes for Prigozhin's point of view. Sorry, go Billy Bob.
The first time I heard about Wagner was in Syria, and allegedly the United States killed about 200 plus Wagners because they got too close to a U.S. military base, and they just opened fire with artillery. You guys familiar with that at all?
When I heard about this late last year, not when it happened, late last year is when I first read of this. Yeah.
I just read someone that basically said that didn't happen. That didn't occur.
Okay.
I read someone else.
I can't remember offhand, but I don't really know.
I read someone else who said this really hurt Prigozhin, and he was very, very upset by this and not being acknowledged. Who knows?
I remember it happening at the time, and the allegation was, over 200 Wagners were killed by the U.S. military. But if that actually happened or not is, who knows? So
I did hear about it. Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead. I was
no.
going to say, I
No, go,
did
Ian.
hear about it. I would say there's two things to keep in mind. One is we tend to inflate the body counts from these wars.
Sure.
So if you look
for
at
sure.
what we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq, we like to take the actual bodies that we find at a scene and add a couple zeros to that figure. It happens a lot. And I was always under, even when you look at, because I did not hear about when it happened like you, I went back and looked it up. But it seems like even at the time, it was always reported as it was just a sadist militia. So there were apparently some Russian nationals in there. They were probably Wagner affiliated, but I doubt it was just a whole group of Wagner personnel. It was a mix of different, because ultimately what happened was we did have that TOTS line between American and Russian forces. And we were making some diligent efforts not to step on each other's toes because people were worried about escalation. And Russia did say, hey, do these guys belong to you? And Russia did say no. So ultimately, that's what leads me. If it was an entire Russian force, I'm sure they would not have said, no, those are our guys, and told them to back off or do something. But as far as I can tell, it was most likely Syrian-affiliated militia, which apparently included some Russians.
That would leave a bad taste,
What this gentleman was saying was that there was about to be a confrontation between the two, and that Russia came to an agreement with the Americans that they would not attack the Americans, and then as soon as they honored that, the Americans attacked and killed whoever they killed in this confrontation. So and whether they were Russians or militia or whatever, I couldn't say. He seemed to imply that they were that there were Russians, and then the other guy jumped in and said, well, it was all basically apocryphal, but didn't explain that further. So just thought I'd throw that out.
But that was what, like 2016 or even before 2016? I mean, that was a while ago.
Yeah.
Right?
Syria,
I mean, that was so Wagner's been around for a little while. But yeah, they really became popular, of course, like somebody said, in Bakhmut. And they're very popular in Russia. So what strikes me was, when they showed them leaving the town of, and I forget the name of the town, Rostov or something, when they showed them leaving, I mean, they still had a lot of support. And I actually work with some Russian expats, and they really like Prigozhin. And they're like, I mean, I wish Putin was more like Prigozhin, but, from my perspective, Prigozhin seems like a hothead, and it seems like the correct approach is definitely the one that Putin has taken and is taking. It's a way better strategic approach, being patient, not escalatory, responding to escalations by the West, but not yourself really escalating. And I mean, it's the way to go because time is on Russia's side. So I really disagree with the hothead approach that just wants to show the West what we can do, and I think that's, an immature and bad way of dealing with this thing. So I really side with Putin, but a lot of people have this mentality where it's just, no, we need to flex our muscles. We need to teach the West a lesson, and we need to, really, really escalate things. And I think that's not the best approach. So anyway, there's that. He's got a lot of support, and even after he left, nobody seemed really unhappy with him. I mean, as far as the public goes, they still like Wagner, and Prigozhin definitely has a base of support. Right?
Do you know who I thought was a real hothead until this particular event, this little dance? It was President Lukashenko. I thought he was a hothead, too dangerous, to give nukes to or something. And he came out to be the mediator, obviously with the involvement of Rosgvardia, of the FSB. There's a long list of these phone calls. What I want to ask next, before we get to the results of this whole fiasco, is the theme of Western involvement. I mean, the head of Rosgvardia, I'm just going to cheat for a second. He's called Zolotov. He said it was inspired by the West, sort of superimposed onto the ambitions of Prigozhin. And the other guy who said Western involvement was Larry Johnson, former CIA, who said in January the Western intelligence people were in talks with Prigozhin, who played a kind of double agent. He said, sure, I'll serve you information. And then he served information to the Ministry of Defense. I don't know he's got his sources. I'm nowhere near them. I don't know what to think. He believes it's a multi-leveled version of this sort of Russian/Soviet disinformation campaign. What do you think about the
6D chess, Ben? It's 6D chess.
I don't know. It looks like a simple restaurant.
What do you think, Ian?
Well, I'll say I do read Larry Johnson as well. I do like. I mean, if I didn't like him, I wouldn't read him. I do think, however, especially his first hit impressions can tend to be. Maybe he favors the idea of, well, I mean, it makes sense. He's a former CIA guy. So CIA is, you tend to elevate your organization to a certain level, even if you don't ideologically agree with him anymore. So like for example, after the Pentagon leak, he was very convinced that they'd done some sort of MK Ultra brainwashing technique on the kids. And I was just saying, guy, it's some kid on the internet who was putting stuff up there. It was no real conspiracy to it. I mean,
the Jack Teixeira thing. Yeah, he does tend to jump the gun, but then he calms down. Sorry.
Yes, and that's essentially what he did here. Like he was, I saw that first post saying that it was all, Russian military deception, Maskarova, and then his second post was a little bit more level-headed. So I think he does do very good analysis. He just, he kind of brackets the middle ground,
Starts a little sensational, and then
yes.
And what Ian was saying about Prigozhin not being particularly stable, those statements that Prigozhin makes just lead to this kind of conclusion that there's some conspiracy going on, because they're so out of the box, they're so wacky. You're just left to speculate. It's you can relate that to conspiracy theories, where people will call you conspiracy theorists, but you don't have all the information because the people that have all the information aren't willing to give it to you. So you're forced to create a conspiracy. And that's kind of analogous to what I got the sense that Prigozhin was doing to my head.
We all have conflicting feelings. I really respected his guy, not really as a war hero, but as the face of the battle for Artyomovsk. I liked him. I like Kadyrov as well. I like Putin. I hate to see them fight. So all we can do is get into this, because we don't have access to all these intel sources, is to speculate. So I'd like to ask you, not what you know, but what do you think? Was Western intelligence involved in this thing? Just your take. That's all we can do. We don't have access. What do you think?
Well, I think they were certainly trying.
Mm-hmm.
They were trying, like during the Cold War, we were trying to dissolve the Soviet Union from the inside for 50 years. But when the day it happened, it caught everybody by surprise. No one saw it. We were still making movies and books and children's action figures about assuming that this was going to go on for another 100 years. And then when Gorbachev just decided, hey, I'm breaking up the bands, that caught everybody by surprise. It was this huge scramble too. No one had really even thought, like everybody had been obsessed with, Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. But then when the wall did come down, no one had any idea what to do. They had not even thought about what to do afterwards. I think you saw a bit of this here. And the analogy, I was talking to somebody about this earlier today, and this whole thing, what the media has been saying about Prigozhin for the last few months is a lot about, like, if you have a neighbor you don't like and you're spreading gossip about them. It's like, him and his wife, they're not going to work out. They're going to get divorced. She's cheating on him. You're saying all this stuff. Then one day they do actually get divorced, but it's not that you didn't predict it. It's not a real prediction. You were just talking trash, and just by complete coincidence it actually happened. I think that's my theory for what's happened here. Because we love the Russian infighting story. We say it every day, but then a case of it actually happening. It's not us predicting it, and I'm not convinced we actually had any influence on it either. It was just Prigozhin going off the rails. And also, I didn't see any coherent response to that information too, that Prigozhin went off the rails and is marching on Moscow. I did not see any kind of planned movement. Everybody's just kind of scrambling to respond to it. The Ukrainians did not apparently have any kind of coherent battlefield response to Blinken was putting his little committees together. No one really had thought ahead of how to respond to it. So
that's a good point.
It is a good point.
That is a good point.
One thing interestingly came about the White House. I think Karine Jean-Pierre said, we are not taking sides on this because we don't want to strengthen Russia or something like that, which is very interesting. Mark Sloboda said that's putting Wagner on the same level as the Russian military. And he brought this example of January 6th, whatever you think about it. The Russian ministry didn't say we are not taking sides. He said we condemn this violence. We are on the side of the US state. So that was a very weird thing to do. But another response within 24 hours, not before, but within 24 hours, Russian civil war, everything's failing. Everybody must prepare for a collapsed Russia, for chaos, for bloodletting, for everything. They were hysterical about this. Saturday evening, the Western news from Germany, especially the UK, the US was full of these headlines. So while it did come by surprise, there was a lot of elements sort of latching on and getting their wishes fulfilled. I guess wishful thinking, it was what I'd say in the Western press, was very visible, and now it's turned into ash. But that was interesting. Just wonder what you think about
that. Yes, and that's two philosophies, and that goes back. It goes beyond the United States. You see this with the British, like our own Civil War. In the Civil War, British policy, I mean, they didn't just favor the Confederacy. What they really didn't even want the Confederacy to win. What they wanted was the USA to split, because this was actual British policy. Because they said if the USA splits, they will never be a threat to us again. Never. They won't be able to influence Latin America. They won't be able to threaten Canada. They'll never be able to compete with us. They'll be too weak. Russia was, in fact, the only European monarchy to actually recognize Lincoln. No other European monarch did that. Said they told Lincoln, we support you as the president of the United States. We want you to win. And they also said we will not recognize the Confederacy unless you recognize them first. So if there was a treaty between Lincoln and Davis, then Russia would have recognized Davis as the president, but only if the USA did. Up until that point, the Confederacy was an illegal rebellion in the eyes of the Russian monarchy. So, but yeah, that's essentially what we have here. In the Russian Civil War, we didn't return that courtesy. We were picking one side and trying to get that side to win. And it was the same thing here. This whole, we don't want to favor one side or the other. Well, if for whatever reason Prigozhin's wish did come true and a significant element of the military has sided with him, I mean, I think we can very safely bet money that you would have seen Western support for him if he had a chance of succeeding.
But can you imagine that? As Billy Bob said, he's a hothead. He wants to show the might of Russia. And people in NATO, in Ukraine, were like, yeah, he was this criminal who took Bakhmut from us, but now he's the hero. Imagine if he got anywhere near power. Jesus Christ, and they were rooting for this guy.
Well, consider what Truman said in World War II, and this is an actual thing he said, with the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. We should support one side, but it's not, we should let them fight each other and only intervene when one side is losing. That's very much the philosophy of pitting different groups against each other. And it's not even which side is ideologically correct. To Truman, communists and Nazis are the same. He just wanted them both, these two rival foreign powers, to weaken each other. That's how they see it. British
doctrine now turned into US. By the way, do you know why Sun Yat-sen's book, The Status of the Chinese Civilization, 1940, before Mao, is banned in the UK? It has this sentence: when every other country comes for friendship or cooperation, it's usually friendship or cooperation. But when the British come, they want to use you against the spearhead against another country. He wrote that in the 1940s, and that was sort of inherited by the US. Sorry, minor point. I think Billy Bob had something I didn't want to.
I was gonna say, I think it was Bernard at Moon of Alabama. He compiled, I think it was him. He compiled a list of some of the arguments that Prigozhin has been making, and one of those arguments definitely was music to the ears of the Ukrainians, right? I mean, he was saying that Putin was deceived into launching this misguided special military operation against Ukraine. It was based on false pretenses.
Yeah, that
and
was
it was
insane.
some real nonsensical stuff. But the way that it was presented in the article I read, it just seemed like Prigozhin was being an opportunist. He was trying to say things to just kind of attract the largest base of support that he could. So he was saying things for to get anti-Putin people on his side, and then he was saying other things to get the war hawks on his side that wanted more. So he was like playing both sides of the fence, kind of with his rhetoric, and
how did that work out?
Well, I mean, it didn't for him, but what was strange to me though is that he wasn't roundly condemned, and he hasn't been roundly condemned, and he's still kind of and that goes to show the power that he had. It goes to show that the Russian state found itself in a difficult situation where they had this guy with legitimate power. He had control over this very strong military force, and he was a hothead, and he was saying some shit that was detrimental and problematic, and they couldn't just shut him up because he had power, and he kept pushing it and he kept pushing it. But that's my whole thing about this. I think it's kind of what it looks like it is to me. It looks like that unfortunately they were in this situation where this hothead oligarch was in a position of power, and they couldn't really in a good way contain him, and it ended up to what happened. And unfortunately he chose to stand down, and hopefully he's not gonna resurface as a problem in the future, but it's hard to even tell if he won't. But to me, it just is kind of straightforward, and that's the problem with allowing these private interests, right, to have power in a government. And I mean, don't get me started on the problem of capitalism, but that's essentially the problem with capitalism, is when the private interests take over the government and they have too much power, and then the government starts working on behalf of the private interest instead of on behalf of the majority. But now I've really gotten us into some territory, which we don't need to go.
Before that, Carlo,
point out a couple of things. Brian Berletic and other commentators have said, you're talking about Prigozhin marching his forces to Moscow. Well, those forces were using Russian military hardware. Yeah. So where was he going to get?
Why were they following orders? Why were they following Prigozhin's orders?
Where was he? Yeah,
fight the hand that feeds.
Where was he going to get more ordnance?
Right.
To continue battling, if his suppliers of ordnance are the people he's actually battling.
That's a good point. I see what you're saying, because it's not something that militarily had any chance of succeeding, because Moscow is 20 million people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even Rostov-na-Don, it's 1 million people, but as far as I can tell, they just had some tanks set up in the city square. He did not control the city. People were letting them wander around and make a big show in the city square, but he did not control that city either.
So I have a question for you, Ian. Yes. And that is, that's so crazy. That's so crazy. What does that say? That there were enough, 4,000 or 5,000 apparently, of Wagner people that were willing to follow this madman into this mad situation. What does that say? What do you know more? I'm sure on this panel, you know more about military esprit than any of us, all of us put together. And what does that tell you about Prigozhin and the Wagner Group in general? It's so insane to an outsider like me. I can't even contemplate it.
Well, it's hard to say, and that's of course the problem with any private military group, because it's not in the it's not working for because it's much harder to get actual uniforms army personnel, military personnel to do something they're not support to. It's possible, like if you want to do a coup with military personnel, I mean, a lot of coups throughout history did involve military personnel, so it's not impossible. It's just more difficult. But when you have a private entity, it's easier. And so we are hearing some stories that, like one version I had heard on Telegram was that a lot of these soldiers thought they were redeploying and were surprised to find out they were headed to Moscow. So it's just kind of something that happens very fast. They don't even know really how to react to that. And he can feed them information. He can say, well, the military is out to get us. And maybe he was gambling that, because I do think if these guys were driving down the road and people did start attacking them, they would believe Prigozhin. Oh, he's right. You know, Shoigu, big bad Shoigu, who he'd already demonized to them essentially, is sending his goons after us. Maybe that's what he was hoping would happen, but I don't know. It's hard to say. It's just it is an amazing. And it's one of those too. It's like you know, you make a decision when you're drunk. You know, eventually the hangover sets.
It is like that, isn't it?
Yeah,
it is a decision when you're drunk. That's
because
very good.
This is something that was over in 36 hours. If it dragged out longer than that, maybe you would have started seeing people sobering up and realizing, what are we doing? But it happened. It was over and done with so fast, we didn't really get to see how that played out.
Yeah. Okay.
Let me give some silver lining, because I read from the Akhmat battalion, you know, Kadyrov's people, who is official, so they give official press releases that they were sent into Rostov-on-Don, and they were 500 to 600 meters away from Wagner fellows, and they didn't open fire because they didn't get an order. You know, that's discipline, and thank God there was no bloodshed of any sort there. That's the silver lining. But but adding to your point, you know, that he's the head of Wagner, the founding member, the CEO, kind of, but not a military commander, not in any sense of the word. And he spouts this insane, self-contradictory, unhinged lunacy. And he just arrived in Belarus and he's not dead. Do you think that were the case, if he really was? This is what gives me still some, I guess, apprehension about the traitor theory, and maybe there's still a game being played because he's still alive. Wagner has a huge camp now in Belarus, like 150 kilometers from Kiev. Very, very strange in and of itself. And apparently the criminal case against him has stopped, has come to a conclusion. He's not going to be prosecuted. These are very strange. I thought if he was that traitor responsible for dead airmen, you know, nonetheless, he would have got a Kinjal or an FSB guy behind him. They would have just got him. Am I wrong there?
You read my mind.
That's the problem. Well, the thing is, if you make a deal with someone and then you backstab them, then no one else is going to trust you to make a deal. And I think it's because that's essentially what they still need a deal from Ukraine. You know, they have not, because they did not do a shock, and they did not do an Iraq style shock on Ukraine. They didn't crater every government building. They want. I think they've given up trying to deal with Zelensky, but they want someone in Zelensky's government to reach out to Russia and make a deal. But and I think that's why this was especially important to handle carefully, because if he made a deal with Prigozhin, got him to stand down, then stabbed him in the back, well, what would that say to Ukrainians? How are we supposed to trust you? A deal with you if you just made a deal with that guy and then betrayed him. So I think, and use again an example from American history. That's a really
good point. Yeah.
When our Civil War was over, I mean, we were not happy with the Confederacy. We were not happy that they had committed war crimes, not just killings, but there had been like the Fort Pillow massacre. There were definitely cases of very bad behavior, but still, we didn't. There weren't mass killings after the war. We didn't really even ostracize them. A lot of Confederate officers still continued their careers. It was, that blue on blue violence is very difficult to heal. And sometimes you do just have to forgive what's happened and not continue this cycle. I know it's so cliche to say, but, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind kind of thing. But really, that is the only solution that works when you have this type of...
It's not cliche. It's not cliche if you think about Ramzan Kadyrov and Grozny. You know, there were 2 Chechen wars, and people told me the hatred will last forever. They are never going to be... He's the most loyal, servant of Putin there ever was. So hopefully something like that can happen in Ukraine. I wonder if I can get your thoughts on the aftermath, because after these exclamations, the march on Moscow and all that, one guy sided with him was an expat oligarch, no longer in Russia, this Khodorkovsky guy, and nobody else did. Gennady Zyuganov, the KPRF party, the communists, they really don't like Putin a lot, and they came up in support of him. Alexander Dugin did, obviously Kadyrov, General Surovikin. Everybody, the 4 governors of the new region, which is Kherson, Zaporizhia, LPR, and DPR, they all came out immediately in support of Putin, who has jumped from 80% approval to 90%, and Prigozhin is now at 20%. So the aftermath, even though the Western headline said Kiev must take this opportunity to smash Russia and all that, and this is the opening they've been waiting for, the military offensive, on the other hand, has been going on in the Kharkov region without stop. The Russians are still advancing, even during the weekend. So nothing has changed on the front. So what do you think what is the final equation after this, 36-hour civil war in Russia that wasn't? What's the final tally?
Well, it's a bit of a multi-part answer, but I'll give a similar answer to what I said when those Russian neo-Nazis crossed over into Belgorod region. I wrote a post about that. I shared some photos of the way they were digging in and setting up weapons caches in people's houses. I know after the fact, people tried, the Western media and Ukrainian media tried to spin it as, it was a raid. We were in and retreated before the Russian military. It was nonsense. They were there they were planning to stay. It was a Bay of Pigs type operation. Bay of Pigs was, Fidel Castro's regime will collapse. The expats will be greeted as liberators. The opposite happens. They just got rolled up and within a couple days of fighting. And that's essentially what's happened here. For some reason, we're unable to imagine scale appropriately. I mean, Russia has more than 2 million military personnel. They have the National Guards. They have the police. You can resolve problems like with what happened with Wagner just with personnel you have in Russia. You don't even need to touch anything. No unit left the front lines. That's a fact. And that's why I think that the Ukrainians did try to take advantage of the situation, at least according to Russian sources. They did launch a series of offensives on Sunday and Monday morning, but they didn't go anywhere because nobody left the front line. There was no leadership paralysis and it was a little ridiculous to think there would be too, because again, it's just a very large country. Something happens in one region is not going to impact the other. It's just a foolish thing to think. And I would say, as far as a final tally, though, it's still a little early to say. We're not going to see, we'll just have to see how it goes a week from now, a month from now. The big thing is, if nothing happens to Prigozhin, and if Prigozhin doesn't try to do something else, I think it seems like he's learned his lesson. But again, it's too early to say. We're just going to have to see if this lasts. And I think the big date also is July 1st, because that's, from what we understand, when that transition is supposed to take into effect. You need to sign a contract and be an actual soldier in the Russian armed forces, or you need to just go home.
Or go to Belarus. Those are the three options.
Or go to Belarus, yes. So we're going to see how that happens.
It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy on Prigozhin's part, because I think I agree with Big Serge that Prigozhin's great fear was he's going to lose control, or what he saw as control of the Wagner group, and now I think he's essentially lost it. So
yeah,
that's kind.
I think that's definitely for the best. I mean, if that happens, they're building Wagner camps, right? 3 8,000-man camps in Belarus.
Yep.
I mean, that's 24,000 people.
Yeah.
And so we can only speculate what the future is for Prigozhin, for Wagner. I was wondering if you guys wanted to discuss, Prigozhin's feud with Shoigu and, is it Gerasimov?
Yeah,
Gerasimov, yes.
So, my guess is that, he thought that he had real legitimate issues. And, I think it's possible that Prigozhin, saw things like incompetence and saw things like mismanagement and really had what he thought were legitimate, honest grievances against the way that the leadership was prosecuting the war, and probably particularly, how they were supplying Wagner, right? Because he would always complain about how it was being supplied. So we don't know sitting back here how legitimate his grievances were, or if he was just blowing smoke because he was afraid that, he saw the writing on the wall that Wagner ultimately was going to be absorbed into the chain of command with Shoigu and he would be out. But my guess is that he wouldn't do all the things he did if there wasn't some real legitimate grievances that he at least, honestly felt that he had. Do you guys have any insight as to what your thoughts are about, was the Ministry of Defense, holding ammunition in reserve, trying to prepare the southern defensive belts and diverting ammunition there because they were prioritizing defending Crimea from, pressing in Bakhmut. But the thing is, these are decisions that are outside of Prigozhin's, purview. He should let other people make these decisions, and then he shouldn't, air his disagreement the way that he did. And that's, that just shows that he's a hothead and, a prima donna oligarch. But any thoughts on any of that?
Exactly. I have some, but I think I'll let Ian go first because he's the resident.
Well, I would say you described it pretty well, because in general principle, no one writes himself as the villain in his own storybook. You're never going to write yourself as the villain. You're always going to be able to justify it. Even if you're a total sociopath, even, a wife beater or a gaslighter or any kind of, even just the worst person you can imagine, is always going to be able to justify what he's doing and why the other person is wrong. And to at least some extent, he believes it, or at least told himself so often that he believes it. So I think as someone, when you're a prima donna, when you're a self-envisioned alpha male like he is, he takes issue with authority figures over him, and he's not used to that, especially with his business background. He's just not used to being in a military environment where there is someone above, where everybody has a boss.
Chain of command.
Everybody answers to somebody, yes. And he just that's not a system he was able to adapt to, and he just and you can see him just wiggling around and trying to elevate himself by tearing other people down, by taking it out on Shoigu. Shoigu isn't a real military person. He doesn't have enough military experience. He's incompetent. The military is not giving us adequate supplies. He's finding something to complain about. And these are all things that even when you do have legitimate complaints, they should be kept in private, not thrown out into the public like he was.
Up the chain of command, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, I think Ramzan Kadyrov, I'm sorry I quote him a lot, but I really admire that guy. He said, nobody has the entire map. Everybody has a piece of the map. Only Vladimir Putin has the map. And as to Ian's point, there has been on the part of the West and on the part of, I think, Prigozhin, a lot of swallowing your own propaganda, because he left Biber and Dolik, you remember this, in Artyomovsk. They are the defenders. So he is a propaganda guy. And maybe he believed he can take on Shoigu and Gerasimov. But on the reality side, and, the West believed that the Russians are just going to run at the sight of the Leopards, it's ridiculous. What you said, the incursions into Belgorod, NATO and the NATO-related bots, they got the Belgorod People's Republic trending for about 20 hours, and then it went down. That they really believed it's going to be chaos. Moscow Maidan will take over Russia. They believe
there are people who still believe it.
They do? Oh,
yes, you can go.
The Navalny guys?
I'm not kidding. You can tell. I don't know about them, but you can, if you go on Twitter or Quora or any other social media platform, you will find people.
Russians?
Swear, not Russians, but NATO people.
Oh yes, of course.
They believe that there is a Belgorod Republic right now. That there are still.
It's ridiculous.
They believe it.
On the point of what he said, there are two accusations against, especially Shoigu. That's the big feud. It's not that so much Gerasimov. Gerasimov is was you call it the head of the Joint Chiefs, the equivalent to that. So he's not really a commander of anything. Shoigu is also not a commander. He is a defense minister. He does procurement. He does the infrastructure to create ammunition. I mean, Russia has outperformed NATO, the US, EU, everybody in ammunition, arms production. I don't see the point of incompetence at all. I mean, the Russian military industry is just shining right now. So I don't see that. As for corruption, I don't know. Obviously, at many levels, there's corruption. And there's an interesting thing that previously went like I would say an unconfirmed report that the flights going to Turkey on Sunday night, going to Turkey and Georgia, were packed with low-level officials of the Russian Federation just leaving. And it became official when the Speaker of the House Duma, Vyacheslav Volodin, today said that these people, we know their names, they should be marked and be made public because they are a disgrace to this country because they ran in an hour of need. And this is why, sort of my final thoughts, I don't know, we can stay on longer, is I still wait for the photo of Shoigu, Gerasimov, Putin, Kadyrov, and Prigozhin having a nice warm handshake like months from now. Maybe, we can go on analyzing the psyche of Prigozhin, and he is unstable and the PTSD, but maybe there's still being a game played. I'd put it at 10% at this point. I think the whole thing was real, but, thing is, neither of us really know.
Well, yes, it's true. Tickets to Turkey, Armenia went up to 200,000 rubles.
You check the economics of it, so it really spiked.
Yes. So normally a ticket to Istanbul is about 30,000 rubles. I guess that's like $300-400, and it went up tenfold that night. A lot of people. And these are the usual suspects. They're the same type of people who ran away during the mobilization. I'll actually tell you, not to get too sidetracked here, but I'll share you the same story. I was here when that partial mobilization happened.
Tell us.
In Moscow is very interesting because in Moscow you see Russian hipsters who I personally find the most annoying people on the planet. They're like, it's almost like a parody of American. They're actually more annoying to me than American hipsters because it's like a parody of a hipster. They got just the most obnoxious liberal hipster person you can find. Like, just imagine what you see in San Francisco, but in Moscow, they're like even worse. And they have their little motor scooters on sidewalks, just zipping around, and it's horrible. But anyways,
are they all gone?
As soon as that mobilization happened, I did not see an electric scooter for 2 weeks. It was amazing. It was just like, yes. But then as soon as that mobilization started to wind down, they started to come back. And now we're back to the normal number of hipsters. But yeah, it's the same type of people. And there was very, who they are. There's very stereotypical type of people who do not want to get drafted. And they would be in any country. I mean, if you had the UK or Germany or the USA, or even Poland, because Poland did not get reported much, but they did a partial mobilization a few months ago, and they had the same thing. They had a bunch of people leave the country. They didn't even, and Poland is not even at war. There's just people you're always gonna have some people who avoid it.
Cool.
Well, being one of those people during the Vietnam era, I feel like I pretty much turned out to be right.
Yes, you did.
You did. I mean, I was 16 years old and I was watching this bullshit with McNamara in the Gulf of Tonkin. He's on, or it might have been Melvin Laird. He's on the chalkboard and he's talking about the Tonkin and the way the Wikipedia, as if there was actually two Tonkins. The first Tonkin, it was actually it was the South Vietnamese backed by the Maddox and other U.S. naval hardware attacking North Vietnam, and it failed. The second one was the one we all talk about, and I'm sitting there watching it with my father, and I'm looking at him and I'm going, that's bullshit, because my father, who was a barber, he used to cut hair at the Navy Yard to earn extra money on Sundays with my cousin Manuel, and there were these destroyers, there were Maddoxes, in dry dock, and I'm going, these two dinghies, these two little PT boats were supposed to attack this Maddox. I mean, if it's loaded with TNT and you're suicidal, if you're kamikaze, you might be able to make a little hole in it, but it was absurd, and that was my initiation into the Vietnam War. So I said, well, one day I was playing baseball. I don't want to get too anecdotal. I was playing baseball with these guys, and there were two guys in boots and everything, and they'd done tours in Vietnam. So that these idiots are trying to play baseball in combat boots. But beside that, afterwards, everybody's smoking at the fence, and I'm again 16 years old, and they're looking at me, and I got a couple of hits. The guy goes, "How old are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm 16." He goes, "I thought you were 14. That's why you're such a good ball player, not as young, little guy. You're like." And he goes, "You're right for Coochie." And I said, "Well, I didn't know what Coochie was. Come on, man. Give me a break." So I went to the library and I looked it up. That convinced me I wasn't going to go. I mean, I was taking MLK's and Muhammad Ali's point of view. Those fuckers didn't do anything to me in Vietnam. I had long hair. I'm getting beat up over here. And of course, Ali's getting death threats every fucking day.
Mm-hmm.
Fuck this bullshit. So, I don't know if the rationale, I know what you're talking about. I know exactly here with Americans, these virtue signaling ninnies about this conflict who can't see the roots of it and don't want to learn the roots of it. And I don't want to have anything to do with them. But there is a certain point where if you take in the information, you learn what's going on, and you see something's wrong about it, that you have alternatives, and you should take those alternatives. And so I fought my draft board for years, never went, and didn't miss it at all, and have other personal reasons for having done that. But I just want to get that out.
Well, no, and I think it is good because in hindsight, that's absolutely the correct decision. And I think the whole thing about the Russian mobilization is also a bit of projection too, because it's projection. Because I think they know that the American public is actually quite divided on the Ukraine conflict, regardless of what people are willing to say in public.
So is the European public, despite the headlines. Yep.
Yes. So because here's the reality, and I'll say this from personal experience. If you did a large scale, however they justified it, whether it's directly against Russia or not, if you did a large scale deployment to save Western Ukraine or however they dressed it up, you would have to mobilize reservists. You'd have to mobilize National Guard. We're just talking about the USA here. Because if you look up any recent war, Gulf War, invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, you'll find 40-50% of the personnel who went were reservists. So you would have to pull a lot of people out of school, out of their jobs, saying, "Hey, guess what, buddy? You're not going to college tomorrow. You're going to Ukraine." So it's very easy to stand with Ukraine. But if you have to send 500,000 Americans, well,
yeah, right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. I just want to introduce an idea that every time, and I'm glad for this, when Carlos says ninny, we should have a sound effect because it should be every episode. I love it when he says ninny.
It's my favorite word now. Stupid used to be my favorite word for Americans. Now
ninny's better. Ninny's better.
So I think Putin came out looking really good and stronger, right? I mean, it was not pleasant to see the reality of the divisions exposed in that way. And it was a reality I wasn't aware of. A lot of people weren't aware of it, but it was dealt with and it was there. Whether we knew it or not, it was there and it was detrimental. And now it has been exposed and it has been dealt with. Hopefully it's been dealt with. Yeah. And I think Putin is definitely in a much stronger reality now than he was, a week ago before this started. So I think that's another silver lining to this big thing is, exposing that ugly reality. And then it got dealt with, fortunately, with, as little loss of life as possible. 13 people is a lot, but I've heard the reports that, those families are going to be well compensated. It's
not
tragic.
Enough. 50 million rubles is not enough for the loss of a man, a kid. Yeah.
But fortunately, that was the extent of it, because it could have been way, way worse. And it didn't go that way. And I think right now, Putin came out, in a better situation than had existed prior. So that's a silver lining.
I'm with you on that. Before we get some Ian's thoughts on the final, I'd like to get some panicked Western headlines since this thing has calmed down into this show, which is the U.S. expected a lot more bloodshed in Russia. This comes from CNN. Kiev must seize the moment, otherwise it might not get its territories back for 14 years. I don't know where they got number from. That's from the Washington Post yesterday. And the final one was James Cleverly, the fucking British bulldog, who said, for victory, the AFU is just no longer enough. Third-party participation is needed. So bolts, get ready, I suppose. This, to me, smells of absolute panic at what's happened, at the thing coming to an end peacefully within 2 days. Final thoughts, I guess. Sorry, I'm so used to the 1 hour cutoff. It's like built into me.
We could go for 4 hours if we want, but
yeah,
we probably have to use the bathroom before that.
Yeah. Sorry. Ian, what do you think?
Well, I'll actually take the opposite. Well, I mean, I did see that. I did comment
Be a contrarian.
on CNN. First, I do agree on the CNN headline. I actually commented on that a while ago. Actually, I think yesterday. It's kind of an amazing statement to say that they expected more bloodshed, and I believe you've got the quote in front of you. I don't have it in front of me, but I believe
just the headline. I don't have the body.
Was that they expected more bloodshed and the Russian military response to be more effective. So in their mind, if this happened in the USA, if there was some sort of American military unit that got upset and drove to Washington, they would expect, a bombing campaign. They would expect, bloodshed is their word, not my word, is their word. They would expect bloodshed. I mean, even to look at, regardless of what you feel about the unhappy Trump supporters on January 6th, that was, the police used tear gas. They shot a woman. They killed somebody. If that happened, oh my gosh, can you imagine if someone was protesting in Red Square and a Russian policeman just shot that person down in cold blood?
All over the West.
We would still be hearing about it today. So we can imagine if this happened in London or in Washington, if some sort of a bunch of people decided to drive to Washington. I mean, I still think about the time Biden, this was a few weeks after he came into office, he was commenting on an insurrection. He said, if an insurrection were to work, you need some F-16s and some nukes. It's like, excuse me, but nobody should be talking about nukes.
Yeah,
and domestic affairs. It's like so you would use nukes to stay in power is what you're telling me when he said that. But as far as this specifically, I would be a bit of a contrarian to what you said. I don't think this made Putin look stronger. This was a weak moment for him because Prigozhin was a loose cannon for a while, especially now that we have that hindsight that he wasn't acting on orders. He was just being a loose cannon. He should have been reined in sooner. So this isn't a great moment for the Russian government. It's not. And I think and this is also why I don't think it's some sort of elaborate deception either, because this is not a good thing for him, because if Prigozhin had kept quiet and this had not happened, Ukraine really would not have a lot going for it right now, because all of their offensives have been very, very disappointing. This was a godsend for Western media to be able to talk about this internal weakness. If this had not happened, all they would have is just this burned out Bradleys and Leopards. They'd have nothing. It would be really hard to spin that as a justification to keep going another year and spend another.
Yeah,
that's why we encourage contrarian views, because upon hearing your point of view, I completely agree. Yeah, and as Billy Bob said, let's hope it never, ever happens again. And Russia did look bad. It didn't look stable. But there's one more quote. I'll just end with this from my part. And it was Sergei Lavrov. And there was a question from the audience at the Foreign Ministry. How does this rebellion cause problems with our international partners? And he said, with partners and friends, nothing changes. With everyone else, I don't really care. That's verbatim. So, yeah, who knows? But I'm with you. It's 90%. It was a real mental breakdown. I still have a little bit, that 10% hope holding out. But thank you for being a contrarian. I encourage it.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure you're disagreeing with me because I don't think it was a good look either. I think it was awful to expose that reality that I was unaware of and a lot of people were unaware of. It was the reality, but how it was handled. I think, after it's done going forward, the reality is better. And Putin is in a stronger place now than he was before. And, we didn't know about it. And then we saw it happen in real time. And now it's been dealt with. And so now, but anyway, it's a little nuance there. But
I think we all agree on the basics. Yeah.
It was a terrible look. It was a bad look, and it exposed, a real unfortunate thing. And then, they made hay out of it. The West made hay out of it. Ukraine did. But it could have been a lot worse, and it hopefully is behind us.
Yeah, it shocked all four of us. I think that's easy to say.
I'm sorry, but we agree that it's not going to have any material effect on the ground in Ukraine, right?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to. It doesn't seem to have adversely affect the special the SMO. We do have Wagner in Belarus now. They're building again 24,000 beds to house that many Wagners allegedly, and there's a lot of speculation about how Wagner's gonna launch an attack south. And take
Chinese speculation, yeah,
like they were trying to take out Moscow allegedly.
Yeah.
Which, who knows? It's all speculation, but
yeah,
SCMP
and the global
discussion, but I don't want to wrap it up. Go ahead, Ben. What are you saying? I'm sorry, I'll be quiet.
No, you wrap it up. I'm just going to say the SCMP, South China Morning Post, and Global Times, the Communist Party of China, they made these things that maybe it was an elaborate plan to get Wagner into Belarus for them to then strike Kiev. I'm not sure. For my part, I'm not sure if it's a prisoner camp in Belarus or it's going to be a Belarusian PMC now. I don't know. That's the takeaway, I think, from all four of us. We know a lot of the facts, but we don't know we don't have access to everything. So we're not.
I don't want to chase everybody away because we have another 3 hours. We can.
But I want to ask, without the Wagner group, will the Russian military still be able to sustain itself? Because in the articles I was reading, everyone said, well, why did Prigozhin do this? Because the Russian military was doing quite well in Ukraine. And I said, well, yes, but if you took out Bakhmut and other areas where Prigozhin and the Wagner had operated, would they have been as successful? I mean, if you did the math on that equation, and what would be the answer to that? Where would the Russian military be without Wagner's? I guess what I'm asking. I mean, do
you want me to answer, or Ian, or?
Well, I can make an answer at that. So, what Wagner did well was, especially last year, when there was still a huge manpower and equipment disadvantage to Ukraine, when they had 150,000 troops in the Ukraine region. What Wagner did is they brought more manpower in. They brought more equipment in from what I've read on it, where Wagner got most of their vehicles, even their aircraft. What they were doing is they weren't getting it from the Russian MOD directly. They were reaching out to third parties, other countries that have bought Soviet or Russian equipment in the past. And maybe that's just a bit on the old side. If you're some African country with T-64 sitting around, what are you realistically going to do with it? And Prigozhin wants to buy it back from you. Well, why not? Might also be a good way to get around sanctions too, because he's a third party using backdoor, right? And the thing is that the Russian military is not good at, or actually most militaries are not good at, is doing things quickly. The American military is good at doing things quickly, but also we spend 15 times more than the Russian military. The money does go somewhere. It's very hard to do to shift that many resources one direction. So Wagner was a great stopgap for that. I think now it's less important because they have those 300,000 mobilized reservists. They've, from the numbers I've seen, they have over 115,000 volunteers just this calendar year so far. So I don't see them needing that stopgap. And actually, I think the stopgap of Wagner might have outlived its usefulness a bit. It's for all the reasons we've talked about for the past hour. But I think now it's not, you're not going to see any kind of reduction in capability in Ukraine or anywhere else with Wagner. And I think that's actually just a sign, because they told Wagner, they told PMCs, they told those defense militias in Donbass, you know, it's time, we need to stop being kind of an army of the willing, you know, anybody with a gun who wants to show up and help we need to be a little more professional. And that's what that shift was, because they just don't need it anymore. They want to get, it's time to be more professional, more organized, and they don't need those crutches anymore.
And they've got the numbers, yeah.
My pug's going mad. I still think that Bieber, Dolik and all of that was to show that, look, we're so much better than the Russian armed forces. And in reality, you know, they were good, but, you know, not so much better as we have seen on the front line since the Russian military took over. I'm going to leave a novel thought. Sorry, she's not coming down. She's, I don't know, hissy right now. In the age of multipolarity right now that we are living in, the birth of it, maybe you don't need these clandestine, plausible deniability armies that you needed in places like Syria 7 or 8 years ago, in Africa a couple of years ago. Sorry, they're not our guys. Maybe now you can just overtly send the actual Russian military, and that's why the end of the Wagner era is upon us. Just a novel thought. It just occurred to me. I'm not saying this is fact. Speculation on my part. Someone's sending me text, and oh, fuck. Sorry about that.
Well, I think everybody, not just Russia, is going to think twice before having large numbers of mercenaries in a place where it could backfire in the way it did now.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean,
yeah. Let's hope it never becomes a problem again. That's Billy Bob's initial thought. I'm just going to ponytail on it. Sorry.
Well, and you know, and this isn't even the first time. I mean, I can't think of anything that's happened that spectacularly in recent history. But even, you know, Eric Prince's group, there were serious problems with PMCs in Iraq and Afghanistan, with professionalism, with the level of force they were using. Because American troops do tend to be professional and have some sense of morality. But, you know, when you have these private companies coming in who don't care, and especially because they would, like that book you mentioned earlier, that expose of Blackwater mentioned, it was polling a lot, not just because the publicity for Blackwater was that, oh, we were just going to bring in former American military people, which was not the case. They were bringing in just the cheapest quote unquote soldiers they could find. They were recruiting like former right-wing death squads. They were pulling in all kinds of crazy people who should not have been with a gun at all.
Oh yeah.
And so there were problems, and Blackwater was just not used on the scale that Wagner was. So it's not surprising we saw bigger problems when PMCs started being used on a larger scale. So it's unfortunate, but it's a lesson learned at this point.
Yeah.
Cool.
Ian, thanks for your expertise. We appreciate you joining us. We've gone an hour and 20 minutes almost. We're only used to going an hour. We're anything past an hour, we don't know how to do it. But so I don't know how many views we're gonna get. You know, this is the first time streaming on a Tuesday. We usually do okay on a Thursday, but I don't even have, you know, our normal platform. So we'll put this out. It'll be different places. If you want to share it on your blog, that would be great. Any final thoughts before I hit end broadcast? Because I will end the broadcast right now if not.
No, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. My last thought.
Yes, thanks, Ian. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Do you remember the Battle of the Musicians? I mean, there was a short-lived Mozart group as well, and they're no longer around. Wagner's still here as part of the Russian military or going home, but they're still here. My finishing thought.
All right.
Okay. Hey, we'll be back on Thursday at the normal place with the Foreign Policy Review. We'll see you then. Thank you.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone.